Thanks for the invitation to present today. I am Jeff Allred. I'm a professor in the English department. I'm also in the Digital Humanities MA program at the Graduate Center. Steering committee member of ASSERT and ASSERT superfan. So it's great to see everyone. And apologies in advance for folks who have kind of heard some flavor of this presentation at some time in the past. I have talked about this assignment before, but you know, hopefully something fresh will come up. I think it dovetails pretty nicely with the awesome work that Jennifer and Sarah were just talking about. All right, so I'm just going to dive into my presentation. Let's hope that it behaves. 1 second with the screen sharing. Okay, can everybody see it okay? Great. So I'm calling my presentation Exploded Research, not so much in the violent sense, but more in the sense that engineers use when you take a finished product and you kind of, in a blueprint or a diagram, break it apart into all its component parts so you can study how its inner workings function. The subtitle is How to Convince Students Not to Finish Their Term Papers, and I'll explain why you would want to do such a perverse thing as we go. The problem I think that I was confronting in this redesigned assignment is a common one, especially my discipline, probably in almost all the disciplines in the humanities at least, which is that we all have students go through the kind of gauntlet of English 120 and English 220. You know, everyone at Hunter takes you know, these courses and gets oriented to some kind of idea of reading and research. And then in the majors, you know, in the sort of the 300 level, we just sort of tell them, okay, give us a 12-page or 15-page research paper based in original research, have an original argument, sort of front like you're a scholar and argue with other scholars, right? And there's just a huge gap between these two levels, and there's not that much in the curriculum, or in my impression in my department is that there's not really very much sort of middling stuff going on in the curriculum that would help students orient themselves to this. I started teaching a new course, a newish course in our department called Introduction to Literary Study, English 252, which is kind of like the gateway to the major, the first course that majors are supposed to take in the major as English majors. And so I thought it was a good chance to really think about developing those middling research skills between what you learn in 120 and 220 and what you will be expected to do at the 300, 400 level. So this hence the idea of taking the final product and the kind of idea of fetishizing the final product and this kind of, you know, sort of, I don't know, I think of it often as the journal article light, L-I-T-E, like, you know, you're aiming at this 20-page thing that you've seen hundreds of examples of, but and you know you can't quite do it, but you're being asked to do something kind of like it anyway. Really deconstruct that, explode that, and look at it and see how it works, and see if we can really focus on the process more than the product. This is a little bit of repetition. I'll try to go quickly, but the big problem is how to bridge the basic skills from the gateway courses 120 and 220 here at Hunter, and the sophisticated skills in 300 400 level. So the assumption is, this is kind of the second bullet point here, that students have some basic close reading skills and some basic research skills, and that we're aiming them at what we call topics in courses in our department. So at the 300 level, where the assumption is that you're going to produce a robust research project at the end. The second problem, and a little more local problem, has to do with scaffolding. How to scaffold in the research and writing skills that you need for students at this level. And so I started thinking about what are the deficits that students are likely to have, and how can I scaffold them in. So sorry, I keep. There we go. I'm sorry, I'm having some navigation issues. So thinking about the deficits that I was likely to meet and have, now that I've taught the course several times, have met, I think students have few skills at this level in decoding kind of secondary literature. Like you give them a 20, 25-page article and they can read the words, but they're not really familiar with the discourse very well. Literary criticism especially is rather forbidding for novice readers. They don't really know, and I'll talk about the research piece in a moment, about which databases are most relevant for their kind of research. In 120, they probably approach this in a very generic way, not a discipline-specific way. So how do you efficiently search for things in my discipline? Third, and getting more complicated, what are the methodologies in the field of English? And English, I think, maybe even more so than some other disciplines, has a really, really wide range of methodologies and assumptions that might vary from course to course and professor to professor that you're exposed to. So what are some of those methodologies? How do you recognize them when you see them? How do you get in the sandbox and start playing with some of these methodologies and using them? Finally, a lack of confidence in having my own argument, devising my own topic, turning that topic into an arguable statement that attaches onto extant discussions that are happening in a field. This is not something that students are going to solve in English 252. Jennifer and I were working with some master's students this week, actually, and they still struggle with this stage as well. But I think this is the moment to kind of intervene and make students aware of what's involved and start practicing that skill. So, I think to get back to this idea of the middle strata, I think we think of learning research in this really, logical, like stair-step way, one step at a time. I think students might experience it or feel it more like this, right? Where it's this kind of very formidable and rude transition from, walking to scaling this massive thing that happens to be frozen, and maybe people are shooting at you at the same time. All right, enough Game of Thrones. So I started thinking about how to address these problems in kind of a reasonable way. And so the first piece is how to decode articles, how to kind of coach students on how to read in this literary genre that, unlike poetry and drama and the novel, is not something that students will have experienced casually elsewhere, is something pretty radically new. I can get into this in the Q&A a little bit, but I like to use Hypothesis, the annotation platform, to read along with students and kind of open up my process to them and see their reading process represented in this kind of asynchronous space of an annotated, socially annotated document. We work really hard on how to devise a topic. How do you think about a topic? What makes for a good topic? What makes for a good topic that's going to work at the scale of, let's say, the 12 to 15 page research paper? How are you going to locate appropriate sources to kind of ground your argument? Finally, how to generate an argument from that topic. How do you make your own critical voice predominate? How do you collate other voices and make your own voice kind of bubble up to the top and kind of be the ringmaster or the conductor of the symphony, kind of making the whole thing go. So the solution to all this was what we might think of as like an exploded research blueprint, or an inside out kind of term paper, or a deliberately unfinished paper. So the assignment is to write the first 4 paragraphs of what you imagine to be this notional 12 to 15 page paper that will never be written. And so the emphasis is not so much on this final product, which is deliberately unfinished, and that really freaks students out. They don't kind of know what to do with it on the front end, especially. So all the energy goes into the stages to get to that point. And so 4 weeks out from the end of the semester, students will post publicly, to, visible to peers, a research question, and then I'll give them some quick feedback, often telling them that it's not a very workable question, or that it's interesting, but it needs to be smaller or bigger or richer or something, right? 2 weeks out from the final deadline, I meet with super librarian Jennifer Newman, who you may have heard of, and we've had Zoom sessions in which she reviews with them some discipline-specific strategies for finding the right databases, using the MLA database, Project Muse database, JSTOR, the strengths and weaknesses of each of these, how you might construct keyword searches, lots of really, really nutritional stuff that they may have touched on in 120 or Library 100, but they haven't really delved into, especially in a discipline-specific way. And besides all that, they need repetition much more than we may realize anyway to keep practicing these skills. At the end of that, immediately following that workshop, they are to produce what I'm calling a simple bibliography, just a list of sites, just to kind of goad them to gather a bucket of sites without doing anything with them. 1 week after that, which is to say 1 week after the project is due, they're submitting an annotated bibliography. And so I assume, you kind of know what that is. Sarah and Jennifer were just talking about it in their own presentation. Pretty generic version of an annotated bibliography, followed by conferences in pairs. And the pairs is just kind of to make the numbers work out that I can spend 10 minutes with each student. Individual takes up too much time. 3 or 4 students at a time is too crazy. So I've just found that a kind of pragmatic way to get FaceTime with every single student. Have a little bit of peer reflection as well, where they can comment on each other's process and product in terms of the annotated bibliography. At any rate, 1 week out, maybe 3 or 4 days out from the deadline, a kind of last chance to these pairs conferences on Zoom to troubleshoot, to see where they are in their process. When the due date hits, they turn in this truncated first 4 paragraphs of a 12-pager. I give them some guidelines, saying that there's no one size fits all, but that every first 4 paragraphs should contain a statement of the thesis, of course, a literature review. And so we talk a lot about what this monster is and what it means to review the literature in our field. And they look at some examples. And then, the rest of the 4 paragraphs can be just giving a little hint as to, where the rest of the argument's going to go. I do ask them also to include a signpost. In other words, kind of a quick tell them what you're going to tell them moment, so that we can see where the rest of the 12 pages are going to go. Finally, and really most importantly, I give them a template with prompts, and those prompts have them reflect on the research process and on the product in some ways. Tell us what you would have told us, even in just bullet form, in the remaining 12 pages. Tell us how you would do things differently if you could start over from the beginning. Tell us about a new research question or avenue of research that occurred to you in the process of doing this research, that you would be curious to pursue in the future. What did you learn about databases and keyword searches? So I've shared with this link here the actual. Did I do that again? The actual template. I'm so sorry. I can't. The screen share and the navigating the slides is hard together. But at any rate, there are links throughout this presentation, which I'll share with Julie and she can share with the group, where you can explore the course site and you can see examples of the actual student work that came out of all these various steps. You can see the template. And so, I'm a huge open teaching fan. Julie alluded to the panel that I'm sharing with Matt Gold and Luke Walzer later this semester. So please steal everything and hack it and repurpose it for your own uses. But I found this a pretty useful approach. Here we go. Back to my slides. Just a quick survey of kind of what I see as the kind of risks and benefits or costs and benefits to this. I think the openness where students see each other's work at every stage along the way really helps to kind of tamp down the anxiety, because you can see the struggles of your peers to articulate a good research question or, have a good annotated bibliography or whatever it is. Emphasis on process over product obviously makes students slow down a bit and not procrastinate and have to really focus on each step independently along the way. And then the kind of ubiquitous constant deadlines and constant feedback obviously opens up the black box a little bit, so students can see where they're going wrong or where they're having struggles or problems before they manifest in the final product and it's too late. The downsides are it's just a lot of paper to manage or pixels to manage, with all the deadlines and even if it's just a sentence or two for each student every time, it is labor intensive, I won't lie. I've cut back on the reading and the other components of the course, the content, if you will, to really focus on this stuff, but it's still a lot. The unfinished product, I think, feels kind of weird and unsatisfying to students, especially once they get rolling. They kind of want to write that full paper. And so it just feels very, very strange and frustrating. Like stopping singing happy birthday to someone after the second bar. You know what I mean? It just feels unresolved and weird. And then one of my colleagues, not a hunter, but in a writing group that I'm in, said, well, that's not how writing works, dude. We only figure out what we're arguing as we write. And often in the process, you get to page 12, and then you go back and you write pages 1 and 2 based on what you kind of wrote your way into. And I think that's the most problematic critique. And so I think maybe this does kind of sanitize the writing process a little bit, or maybe it would work better for some writers with some, whose process kind of naturally fits that process, and would really not work for other students. And I don't have a great, answer to that, other than maybe think about a 2.0 or a 3.0 version of the assignment that gives a couple of different pathways that still focuses on the process. But I wanted to share that because I thought it was a pretty interesting critique. So there's just a blog post that kind of walks through this as well that you can take a look at via that link. You can also see the course site again, where you can kind of dig around in the actual wording of all the assignments, but also what some actual students did with them on my course site.